There's a randomized controlled trial called SYSDIET, run across 6 university research centers in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, that did something most nutrition claims never actually do. It tested the Nordic diet properly, in a controlled setting, on 200 real participants with metabolic syndrome, and measured exactly what happened to their bodies over 18 to 24 weeks. This matters more than it might sound like at first, because most claims about a culture's diet being uniquely healthy never actually get tested this rigorously. Usually it's an observation. People in this region tend to live long, here's what they tend to eat, therefore the food must be responsible. That's a reasonable starting hypothesis, but it's not proof, because 100 other factors, genetics, activity levels, healthcare access, could just as easily explain the outcome. SYSDIET actually controlled for that. Researchers took people, assigned half of them to eat a specifically defined healthy Nordic diet and half to eat a control diet, kept their weight stable throughout, and then measured the biological difference directly, in blood and urine, not just in self-reported feelings of well-being. The results were specific and measurable. Lower LDL cholesterol, reduced markers of inflammation in the blood, better glucose control, improvements in blood pressure, not vague wellness claims, actual clinical outcomes, published and peer-reviewed. So today, we're going deep on 5 specific foods behind those results, what the research actually found for each one, and why these 5, out of everything Scandinavians eat, seem to matter the most. And just before we get into it today, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy the videos, please consider subscribing. It's a quick, easy, and free way of supporting the channel, and it helps out more than you know. So thank you. Let's start with the one that shows up on almost every Nordic table, in some form, nearly every single day. Rye bread. In Denmark, it's called rugbrød, a dense, dark, sourdough loaf that looks almost nothing like the soft white bread most of the world defaults to. And the difference isn't just texture. Rye bread is a whole grain food, meaning the entire grain, bran, germ, and endosperm stays intact rather than being stripped away during processing. That intact structure is where almost all of the actual benefit comes from. Researchers in the SYSDIET study specifically measured something called plasma alkylresorcinols, a biomarker that shows up in the blood as a direct reflection of how much whole grain rye and wheat someone has actually eaten, not just reported eating. Using that objective marker, they found a real association between higher rye intake and more favorable blood lipid outcomes in people with metabolic syndrome. In a separate analysis, researchers found a significant correlation between higher intake of rye bread specifically and lower levels of a marker called hsCRP, a blood marker of systemic inflammation. Lower hsCRP is generally a good sign, associated with reduced long-term cardiovascular risk. What makes rye particularly effective, compared to more processed whole grain products, is the fiber structure. Rye fiber slows the release of sugar into the bloodstream after a meal far more than most other grains, which means a slower, steadier rise in blood sugar rather than a sharp spike followed by a crash. That single mechanism connects to several of the SYSDIET findings simultaneously: better glucose control, reduced inflammation, and more stable energy throughout the day. A slice of dense, dark rye bread with a meal isn't a minor dietary detail. It's doing real, measurable metabolic work in the background. There's a texture difference worth mentioning too, because it actually changes how much people eat, not just what they eat. Rugbrød is dense enough that a single thin slice feels genuinely filling, unlike a soft white roll that can be eaten 3 or 4 at a sitting without much sense of having eaten very much at all. That density isn't an accident of baking tradition. Rye flour simply doesn't rise the way wheat flour does, producing a compact, heavy loaf almost by default. The result is a food that's harder to overeat, purely because of its physical structure, which matters just as much for long-term metabolic health as any individual nutrient does. From the grain on the table, let's move to what typically sits beside it: fatty fish, herring, salmon, mackerel. Nordic dietary guidelines specifically recommend up to 3 servings a week, and this isn't a soft suggestion. It's one of the most consistently emphasized components of the entire Nordic diet framework. The reason comes down to a specific type of fat: omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, are present in genuinely high concentrations in cold water fatty fish, in a way that's difficult to replicate through most other common food sources. In the SYSDIET biomarker analysis, fish intake showed up as one of the clearest, most distinctly identifiable dietary signals in the entire study, detectable through specific fatty acid markers in blood plasma. Fish, along with whole grains and polyunsaturated lipids, characterized the healthy Nordic diet group so clearly that researchers could distinguish it from the control diet group with remarkable statistical precision, over 95% accuracy, just from blood and urine samples. The health mechanism here is well established beyond just this one study. Omega-3 fatty acids reduce triglycerides, support healthy blood vessel function, and appear to have a genuine anti-inflammatory effect throughout the body, which connects directly back to the reduced inflammation markers found across the broader Nordic diet research. Herring specifically, often eaten pickled or cured across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, has been a dietary staple for centuries, long before anyone understood the biochemistry behind why it might be doing the body so much good. What's worth noticing here is how differently fish gets treated in a Nordic diet compared to how it often gets treated elsewhere. In a lot of Western eating patterns, fish is an occasional menu choice, something ordered at a restaurant every few weeks, competing against chicken and beef for a spot on the plate. In Nordic households, it's closer to a default protein, prepared simply, often pickled, smoked, or lightly pan-fried, appearing on the table with a regularity that turns 3 servings a week from an aspirational health target into just an unremarkable Tuesday. The consistency matters as much as the food itself, because omega-3 levels in the body respond to sustained intake over months and years, not to an occasional serving here and there. Now, I should say this clearly, because decluttering advice can become another form of entertainment if there is no system behind it. Watching one video, removing a few things, and feeling motivated for a day is not the same as building a home that stays calm. That is precisely why I created the Scandinavian Reset. It guides you step by step through how to assess your home, simplify what is creating friction, and build routines that are realistic enough to continue after the initial motivation disappears. It is not about perfection or creating an empty showroom. It is about creating a system that works for your actual life. You can find it linked in the description, pinned in the comments below, or just go straight to scandinaviansecrets.shop. Back to the food, and specifically to something that quietly ties the entire Nordic diet together: rapeseed oil. If the Mediterranean diet has olive oil as its defining fat, the Nordic diet has rapeseed oil, known in North America as canola oil, and the science behind it is genuinely distinct, not just a regional substitute for the same idea. Rapeseed oil is particularly rich in alpha-linolenic acid, a plant-based omega-3 fatty acid, along with a favorable balance of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. The SYSDIET research specifically identified rapeseed oil intake through a biomarker called serum phospholipid alpha-linolenic acid, and higher levels of this marker correlated with the improved lipid profiles seen across the study. One of the meaningful differences researchers point out between the Nordic diet and the Mediterranean diet is exactly this fat source. The Nordic diet relies mainly on polyunsaturated fats through rapeseed oil, while the Mediterranean diet leans more heavily on monounsaturated fats through olive oil. Both approaches show real cardiovascular benefit, but through slightly different biochemical pathways, which is part of why researchers consider the Nordic diet a genuinely distinct, evidence-backed dietary pattern, not simply a colder climate imitation of something Mediterranean. There's a practical reason rapeseed became the Nordic fat of choice too, separate from the nutrition science. Olive trees don't grow in Scandinavia. Rapeseed, with its bright yellow fields that stretch across the countryside in early summer, does, reliably, in a climate that makes importing olive oil an expensive proposition for most of history. What started as a matter of local availability turned out, once researchers actually looked closely, to carry its own distinct and well-documented health profile, which is a pattern that repeats across almost every item on this list. The Nordic diet wasn't reverse-engineered from a health outcome. It was built from what the land actually provided, and the health benefits turned out to be built in. From the cooking oil to something Scandinavians don't grow so much as gather: berries. Lingonberries, bilberries, the wild Nordic relative of the blueberry, and in some regions, cloudberries, foraged directly from forests under that right to roam law we've talked about on this channel before, the one that lets anyone walk onto almost any land and pick what's growing there. Berries showed up as a specifically identified marker in the SYSDIET biomarker panel 2, tracked through plasma beta-carotene levels alongside other plant-based antioxidant compounds. Wild Nordic berries tend to have notably high concentrations of anthocyanins, the plant compounds responsible for their deep red and blue coloring, and these compounds have been studied extensively for their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. Because Nordic summers are short and intense, with long daylight hours concentrated into a brief growing season, some researchers have proposed that wild Nordic berries may develop even higher concentrations of these protective compounds than berries grown in longer, milder growing seasons elsewhere, as a kind of plant response to that compressed, high-intensity light exposure. The research on that specific mechanism is still developing, but the base finding, that regular berry consumption correlates with the improved health markers seen across Nordic diet studies, is well supported. The foraging culture behind this deserves its own moment too, because it changes the relationship people have with the food itself. Picking lingonberries in a forest, filling a bucket over the course of an afternoon, isn't the same act as grabbing a plastic clamshell of berries off a supermarket shelf, even if the nutritional content on paper looks similar. Foraged berries tend to be eaten seasonally, in genuine abundance for a few weeks and then preserved as jam or syrup for the rest of the year, rather than consumed in small, out-of-season portions purchased year-round at a premium. That seasonal rhythm, feast during the short Nordic summer, preserve and ration through the long winter, is baked into the culture as deeply as any individual nutrient is baked into the berry itself. And finally, the food group that might be the least glamorous on this entire list, and arguably the most quietly important: root vegetables and legumes. Potatoes, carrots, rutabaga, alongside beans and other legumes, form the vegetable backbone of the traditional Nordic diet, chosen historically for a very practical reason. They store well through long, dark winters without refrigeration, and they grow reliably in a climate that isn't especially forgiving to more delicate produce. Researchers studying the new Nordic diet framework specifically noted that roughly 80% of the food items included in the recommended pattern should be possible to grow within the Nordic region itself, and root vegetables and legumes make up a significant share of that locally grown foundation. Nutritionally, this food group delivers exactly what the rest of this list needs to actually work as a complete system: high fiber content that complements the rye bread's blood sugar effect, plant-based protein from legumes that reduces reliance on red meat, which the Nordic diet framework specifically limits, and a steady source of micronutrients that doesn't depend on imported, out-of-season produce. It's the least discussed part of the Nordic diet in most popular coverage, and probably the most foundational. There's also a cost and accessibility angle here that's easy to overlook when the conversation focuses entirely on biomarkers and clinical trials. Rye bread, root vegetables, and legumes are, without exception, some of the least expensive foods on any grocery list, in any country. That matters enormously for whether a dietary pattern is something a population can actually sustain for decades, versus something that only works as a short-term intervention for people who can afford salmon 3 times a week and imported berries year-round. The genuinely healthy backbone of the Nordic diet was never the fish or the wild berries, impressive as those are. It was the humble, storable, inexpensive foundation underneath them, which is exactly why the pattern has survived, largely unchanged, for centuries longer than any modern health trend has existed. 5 foods. Rye bread, for stable blood sugar and reduced inflammation. Fatty fish. For omega-3s the body struggles to get anywhere else in the same concentration. Rapeseed oil. For a distinct, well-studied fat profile that sets the Nordic diet apart from its Mediterranean cousin. Wild berries, for a concentrated dose of antioxidant compounds. And root vegetables and legumes, the quiet, unglamorous foundation that makes the entire pattern sustainable through a genuinely difficult climate. None of these are exotic. None of them require a specialty grocery store or an expensive supplement. That might be the most important finding buried in all of this research. The Nordic diet wasn't designed in a lab to be the healthiest possible pattern of eating. It emerged, over centuries, from what a difficult climate actually made available, and only decades later did researchers go looking for why the people who'd been eating this way for generations seemed to be doing so well. There's a broader lesson in that sequence worth sitting with. Health outcomes this consistent rarely come from a single miracle ingredient, whatever a headline might promise. They come from an entire, boring, repeatable pattern. The same handful of foods, eaten in the same rough proportions, week after week, for an entire lifetime. Rye bread on its own wouldn't do much. Fatty fish eaten once a month wouldn't move the needle. It's the combination, sustained without interruption for decades, that shows up in a blood test as lower inflammation and better cholesterol. That's a much less exciting story than a single superfood, but it's the one the actual data supports. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually behind Nordic longevity, hit the like button, subscribe to Scandinavian Secrets, there's more where this came from, and in the comments, tell me what video you want to see next. I read every single one, and a lot of what ends up on this channel starts right there. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.